Welcome to today's webinar, The Fight for Decent Work, Tackling Low Wages, Precarious Work, and Poverty. My name is Laura Cattari, and I'm Campaign Coordinator for the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction's Fix the Gap campaign. And I'm also pleased to introduce our webinar guest speaker, Deena Ladd, Coordinator of the Workers Action Center. For the past 25 years, Deena Ladd has been working to improve wages and working conditions in the sectors of work that are traditionally dominated by low wages, violation of rights, and precarious and part-time work. She is active in the Fight for 15 and Fairness campaign, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, and in the Social Justice Committee at her daughter's elementary school. Deena is one of the founders and coordinators of the Toronto Workers Action Center. The Workers Action Center organizes to improve wages and working conditions for low-waged workers, women, racialized, and immigrant workers in precarious jobs that face discrimination, violation of rights, and lack benefits in the workplace. Welcome, Deena, and thank you for joining us to lend us your wisdom on enhancing labor standards and workers' rights.
Thank you, Laura. So I think we're going to just get going. It's great to join this conversation, and I really hope to give you a sense of some of the things that are happening around the fight for decent work and how we can start to tackle low wages and precarious work. So if we could move to the first slide, that would be great. So I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but basically the Ontario Ministry of Labour launched the Changing Workplace Review in early 2015. And this is reviewing the Labour Relations Act and the Employment Standards Act, and both pieces of legislation are being reviewed together. Now, the Labour Relations Act governs unions and how you actually bring in a union in a workplace, and how that process happens. And the Employment Standards Act is for those workers who are not in a union, and this provides the basic floor of protections and working conditions that employers have to follow. So about 6 million workers in Ontario are covered by the Employment Standards Act. And of course, about 30% of all workplaces are unionized, and so that's where the Labour Relations Act comes in. And so this is the first time that these two pieces of legislation have ever been reviewed together. And what's interesting is that because of a lot of the organizing that has been happening to ensure that the government has been made more aware of the rise of precarious employment and the kinds of changes that have been happening in our workplaces, that they announced this review in reaction to a number of studies, a number of organizing initiatives. And so the review is with a lens of precarious work. And so why this is significant and why people need to be paying attention to this is the fact that this is really a once-in-a-generation moment to make significant changes. The changes that happen through the review will probably be our legislation for the next 20 to 25 years. And so this is hugely significant when we think about all the people in our communities and indeed our own families who are all, dealing with precarious work, low wages, and the kinds of conditions that are out there. And so I'll talk about at the end of the presentation where things are at with the review and the process. But what I'd like to move to is setting a bit of the context as to what has been happening with our employment and why this is so significant. So as you can see from the slide that's up on the screen right now, part-time and temporary jobs are growing faster than full-time jobs. And what this slide shows is how the growth of part-time employment since 2005 has rapidly outpaced full-time employment. And so we know that many people in our communities are juggling 2 or more jobs now just to cover the basic necessities. And moving to the next slide, what we see again is a similar trend where you see temporary employment is outpacing permanent employment. And again, I'm sure this is no surprise to many of you on this call. Moving to the next slide, we see then what does this all mean? Well, if we look at the stats from 2014, and I would say that it's getting worse, is that we see 41% of jobs are part-time, temporary, or self-employed, and we've seen just even in Southwest Ontario that those numbers start to jump to 50%. That half of workers only have a full-time permanent job. And so we've seen here that the gaps in our labor laws have failed to regulate the growth of part-time, temporary, and self-employed work. And so because there's not been active regulation, we're seeing this dramatic change in in the types of work that's available. And so moving on to the next slide, we see, well, what does this mean in terms of income? Well, we've seen huge rifts, steep rifts have grown between the wages of part-time, temporary, and full-time workers. You can see here a 57% wage gap in median hourly wages between women in part-time jobs and women in full-time jobs. For men, that gap is 47%. The median hourly wage is for part-timers is $12.38, and we find obviously temporary workers are not doing too much better. Temporary workers have a median hourly wage just over $15, whereas you look at their full-time counterparts, which are earning $24 an hour. And so discrimination in wages is one reason why Ontario has such a low-wage labor market. And one of the reports that I'm going to be relying on heavily through this presentation is our report called Still Working on the Edge, where we interviewed many workers who've become involved in the Workers' Action Center about the kinds of conditions. And Sung, obviously she's a pseudonym, she's one of those workers, and her quote is on the next slide that you'll see. She has 2 jobs with a community mental health aid organization. Her 10-hour-a-week part-time job paid $23 an hour, but her relief job paid only $16 an hour. She did exactly the same work, but for lower pay when she worked as relief. And so that's what I mean in terms of discrimination in wages, where because of the type of job you're doing or how you're hired, you can get paid quite differential wages. But as we know, moving to the next slide, full-time jobs are no guarantee out of poverty. Almost 1 in 10 Ontario workers now earn minimum wage, and that minimum wage is almost, is around 16% below the poverty line. And so we know low wages are a key feature of precarious work, and low wages are also on the rise. In 2014, 33% of Ontario workers earned low wages. That's up from 22% a decade earlier. And new data that's been released shows that now we've got 1.7 million workers in the province who are earning $15 or below. And so this is a huge issue. So even though the minimum wage has gone up now to $11.40 for most workers as of October 1st, the percentage, even though it's supposed to be at the floor, a lot of employers are now paying people minimum wage. Insecurity and unpredictability are creating real hardships also for many people in precarious work. It's flexibility for employers, but it's not flexibility for workers. Again, one of the biggest areas of growth in Ontario in terms of jobs is retail, but we've seen many retail workers experiencing employers who want a 5-day commitment from you, but will only schedule you for 2 or 3 days. So employers won't guarantee workers a minimum number of hours, but they want workers to remain on call for last-minute schedule changes. And so Moving to the next slide, we know that many workers don't know from 1 week to the next how many hours of work they'll get. So for some workers, like Miguel, who's also in the report that we've released, it means long hours with no overtime pay. And as you can see, he's basically saying you can't get a schedule. And so we know many workers who phone the Workers Action Center because they've got a problem on the job, don't get a schedule. It goes from day to day, or they get their schedule on Sunday. And on Sunday, that's where they find out whether or not they have 40 hours of work a week or they've got 8, and when they're going to need childcare and how they're going to balance another part-time job is just a couple of the stresses that people are constantly dealing with. Moving forward, as we know, for other workers, it's not enough hours. This creates substantial stress for workers and their families. For example, Isabel, who works in early childhood education, as she says, her shifts are truly irregular. Sometimes she works at the school for 2 hours in the early afternoon and then for another 2 hours in the afternoon. These hours vary from each day and every week. And we've just also heard the, interesting example of the Toronto District School Board having a huge dilemma on their hands, not even being able to get school bus drivers because of the split shifts. And so there's been a real crisis in Toronto of not being able to get kids to school because the school bus drivers have split shifts and very low wages and, of course, no benefits. So even though they're doing such an important job, such as, early childhood education, they're not being compensated fairly. So moving on, we know that people in precarious work also have the least access to employment benefits. And so with low incomes and no health benefits, many people have to make choices of paying for prescriptions or paying for food. And we know through the work of Wellesley Institute, they found that the lower your wages, the less likelihood you're going to have drug and dental benefits. And so many workers have no access to paid sick days, and so many go to work sick. And so people in precarious work also have little protection when wages go unpaid, and in some sectors, violations are widespread. Alberto is a non-unionized construction worker, and as the quote says, he reports that 98% do not receive overtime pay, vacation, public holiday, or any insurance. And in some ways, and this is what we're finding, is that the problems have become so big and so basically normalized that a lot of workers sometimes don't even know that they are violations because the violations are just so normalized in sectors like cleaning, for instance. And so Alberto is not alone. A key feature of precarious work is little protection against employer violations. So if we look at generally the features of precarious work, here's you'll see on the slide that these are some of the types of work I'm sure that you see in your community. The unequal wages and treatment, low wages, lack of access to benefits, insecurity of hours, and inadequate protection. And so what's been clear from the work at the Workers Action Center, the bottom has really fallen out of the floor of our minimum standards. And so even though this is a floor that should provide the base from which we build decent wages and working conditions, it really has broken down. And so the resulting gaps, we feel, have really destabilized the labor market. And this has really harmed workers and their families. But I think it's really important to know that it also harms employers who are also trying to do the right thing and to follow the law. And when there is no level playing field, then, it makes it more difficult for the good employers out there. And so what I want to do is now bring this back to the changing workplace review and talk about the key changes that we want to see and what we've specifically identified as some strategies to raise the employment standards and close the gaps in employment standards. And so for those of you who may be dealing with issues of poverty, the ESA is really critical in addressing precarious work, as As I said, it sets out minimum terms and conditions of work, such as wages, hours, vacation, and termination, and it reflects on norms of what standards should be met in our jobs and in our labor market. It really is supposed to establish this minimum floor for those who have the least ability to negotiate fair wages and working conditions. And so for many of the workers in our communities, the minimum is probably what they'll ever get. And so if that minimum is so low, then it's a real problem. And so we see that the employment standards is a central feature of labor market regulation, but it's also an important social policy tool in fighting poverty. And that is quite critical for us to understand, especially if we are looking at trying to address issues of poverty. And so we have identified 6 major areas within the Employment Standards Act that we feel are contributing to the falling floor of standards and precarious work. And so I'd like to go to the first area, which is ESA exemptions and special rules. Now that doesn't sound very sexy, does it? Well, you're probably wondering, what the hell does that mean? Well, let me explain what this means. So exemptions and special rules have been adopted over the years, and we find that they've not only eroded the floor, but they've also created huge gaps that some workers fall through. So for instance, employers can get special permits from the Ministry of Labor to lower protections from long hours of work and overtime pay. Employers have been really successful over the years in getting outright exemptions. So for instance, you can see that farm workers are exempted from even getting minimum wage, hours of work, daily rest periods, time off between shifts, weekly, bi-weekly rest periods, eating periods, overtime, public holidays, and vacation. IT workers are exempted from overtime pay, so that means that a lot of IT workers can work hundreds of hours with absolutely no overtime pay compensation. And so these exemptions allow employers to reduce labor costs and increase flexible staffing strategies. And at the same time, those exemptions decrease the income that workers get and the security that workers get. And so what we find is that there's so many different exemptions and which have a huge impact. Here you'll see that because of an exemption of from unpaid personal emergency leave, so in the employment standards right now, if you work in a workplace that is above 50 workers, you get 10 unpaid emergency leave days, fully job protected, and you can use them if you are sick, if your kid gets sick, if you have to take your mom to an important doctor's appointment. But if you happen to work in a workplace with less than 50, which is 1.7 million workers, you have nothing. You have no job protected unpaid leave, let alone paid leave. So we find that 1.7 million workers in Ontario have no legal right to take an unpaid personal emergency leave. And of course, when you look at workplaces with less than 50 workers, you're looking at restaurants, you're looking at childcare centers, you're looking at personal support work that happens, you're looking at nursing homes, you're looking at workplaces where workers have more access to the public. And so this really, really does not make sense. And then we see that 2/3 of low-income workers do not even have full-time overtime pay protection under employment standards. And as you can see here, what's really shocking is that research just recently done and released for the Changing Workplace Review sees that the accumulated costs of all of these exemptions for basic things like overtime pay, public holiday pay, is resulting in $45 million being lost to Ontario workers each week. That is staggering. That is staggering. And so that is why, we are really pushing to ensure that there is a floor of standards and no exemptions and no special rules. So moving on to the second area, if you can remember Adolfo, he was dealing with the issues of inequalities in wages and employment conditions. And so we find that temporary jobs, erratic scheduling, insecurity of hours of work, and lack of permanence is creating substantial income security and challenges for workers and their families. The employment standards gives the employer huge control over hours of work and scheduling. We find some people working too many hours, and some workers not getting enough hours. And so the redistribution of work hours is really central to addressing distribution of earnings as well, and allowing workers to have more control over their lives. And so right now, the Employment Standards Act does not prevent employers from scheduling shifts of 1 or 2 hours. It does not require employers to guarantee a minimum hours of work in a week. So as we've talked before, for many retail workers, the employer expects workers to be fully available for the week, but there's no minimum guarantee. So you could be scheduled for 8 hours or 10 or 15 or 20. You don't know until you get your schedule. So the expectation that workers will be available for part-time shifts fully, but with no guarantee, creates underemployment, as you're not allowed, as you can't plan your lives and take on maybe another job. So our recommendation here is to address hours of work, to include measures to make work hours more predictable, healthy, and economically secure, ensure that people are allowed to access sick leave, improve vacations, and obviously paid sick leave. So the third area, moving on, is about how the gaps and the lack of regulation in employment standards have really shifted the costs and risks of staffing strategies onto workers who can least afford it. And so, for instance, the laws have been pretty silent on terms and conditions of work for part-time, temporary, contract, casual, or full-time workers. And in the absence of regulation, this has been left up to employers. So we've seen the consequences of this, the growth of low-wage part-time and temporary work, and employers discriminating between workers solely on the basis of the number of hours or term of work. And as demonstrated earlier, this has created huge wage gaps between part-time, temporary, and full-time workers. Most countries in Europe and Australia, for instance, have introduced regulations to prevent discrimination of wages and working conditions of people doing the same work but for different number of hours per week or term of work. And so our report and the changes that we're pushing for are making recommendations to require equal pay, benefits, and treatment for workers doing the same work but classified differently, such as part-time, contract, temporary, or casual. And so this is trying to undercut the kinds of low wages just because of how you're being termed. So the next area of problems that we're trying to address is the fact that the gaps are in the Employment Standards Act have made it that workers are not even protected by legislation. And we found that employers have been really trying to find ways to avoid their responsibilities as employers. And so, exclusions such as independent contract work have created incentives for employers to move more workers into these forms of work. So we've seen a huge growth in employees misclassified as independent contractors, and this is happening in sectors such as cleaning, trucking, food delivery, construction, IT, business services. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that when workers are misclassified as independent contractors, they get cheated out of vital benefits and protections. They lose out on decent wages, overtime pay, paid leaves, employer-provided benefits, and pensions. And so as you can see here, the impacts of misclassification are huge, not just for workers, but also our tax-funded services. And we found this recent review of the construction industry in Ontario, and we found that just even in 2 years, the annual estimated revenue losses to workers' comp, the tax system, our pension plan, NEI, was in the order of $1.4 billion to $2.4 billion due to misclassification, which is a huge amount. So the fifth area is the use of temporary agencies. And so many of us in our communities have been seeing this increase in temp agencies. And it's another way in which employers are shifting their responsibility onto a middle person. We've seen the industry enjoying impressive gains following the last recession, increasing its revenue from $8.3 billion in 2009 to $11.5 billion in 2012. And so many businesses are looking at, and these agencies are looking at expanding their services and to ensure that workers are also potentially placed as independent contractors. And so you see that the example we have here is where, one of the workers that we are working with who works in a group home for people with disabilities, she has to pay, she's classified as an independent contractor, and she has 7% deducted from her minimum wage to work as an independent contractor, working 48 hours over 3 days, and she gets no overtime, no vacation, or public holiday pay. And yet workers in that same facility who are hired directly are making between $17 to $23 per hour. And so, the government has started to make some changes here. We pushed for joint and several liability in 2014. What does that mean? Well, it means that if it's a company using a temp agency, they will be held jointly responsible for wages, overtime pay, and public holiday pay if that agency does not pay those workers. And so what we are wanting to ensure is that there is full joint liability on all employment standards, and in particular on injuries that happen at work. Because as we know now, if you're injured on the job, it's the temp agency that is termed as the employer and takes the penalty or the hit for that injury, but not the client company. But it's the client company where the worker is working and should be held jointly responsible for the conditions. Again, we see most European governments adopting provisions for equal pay and working conditions for temp agency workers and their directly hired co-workers. And so this reduces the cost that workers have to bear for temporary work and shifts the cost of flexibility onto employers where it should be. Contracting out work that can be done in-house is another practice that is re-emerging. And so again, we see employers using contracting as a key strategy to reduce labor costs and shift liabilities down the chain of production. And so again, we are wanting to ensure that that employers, are held responsible. And so we have a series of recommendations aimed at closing the gap, providing a universality of coverage for workers, and to restrict discriminatory practices in wages and working conditions for temp agency, part-time, and temporary workers, and end misclassification. I also just want to mention here around migrant workers. We know that workers coming through the temporary foreign worker program have, very little real access to employment standards protections because the federal immigration program sets out conditions that effectively push workers beyond the reach of protections. And so we are trying to look at changes that would provide stronger protections for workers who are here as migrant workers. So for instance, stop employers from deporting workers who file complaints, allow a longer period of time for workers to file complaints, ensure that there's ways in which workers can file anonymous complaints and get more proactive investigations. So moving to our fifth area, I want to talk about the lack of effective enforcement. And so in the newspapers, we read time and time again about workers experiencing wage theft and not getting even paid their basic wages. But in addition to that, we find that violations of basic standards such as overtime pay, vacation pay have become the norm. And so the system right now largely relies on workers themselves to make individual claims for unpaid wages, and only when the employer does not voluntarily pay up does the ministry order the employer to pay and consider using tickets which is a fine of about $360. The government has started to do some proactive measures, and we're pushing there to be more, because unless there's a system, we need a system that can detect violations, and for many workers, and I'm sure you see these in your communities, many workers say that, well, if I file a claim or a complaint while I'm still working, I'm going to lose that job, and which makes workers not file complaints because obviously they don't want a job is better than no job. And so we need some substantial measures to improve enforcement. And so there are three main areas of recommendations that we are suggesting to improve enforcement. Number one is increasing the risk of detection. And so this is where there's more proactive enforcement, where we see the government enforcing up the chain of subcontracting and making sure employers at the top are responsible for violations. We are wanting them to bring enforcement and proactive enforcement into workplaces while they're still on the job and not when people have left. The second is increasing the cost of violations, and so we have a whole slew of recommendations for those employers who are caught in violation of the Act, having to face stiffer penalties, having to pay damages and interest paid on wages. And also the third area is supporting workers to enforce their rights. And so this would include recommendations to support workers to enforce their rights through individual claims and ensure that they could do anonymous complaints and to get more supports for this. The last area of change that we're seeking is ensuring that workers who want to organize and seek collective representation can actually do that. And so the current system largely relies, as I've said, on workers individually having to detect the violations and try and enforce those violations through individual claims. And as we've talked about, most workers can't do that while they're on the job. So we're looking at ways to recommendations that include unjust dismissal. So right now under employment standards, you can be fired with no reason at all. And so we would like to make sure that there's just cause dismissal and that workers through the Labor Relations Act can more easily form unions. And in sectors where it's difficult for workers because of the type of work they do, like live-in caregivers or small workplaces, retail shops, that there's access to sectoral bargaining, which is about creating standards and raising the wages and working conditions in specific sectors of work, so that it's not based on individuals having to try to get those improvements. And so we're trying to figure out ways in which workers can have a voice if they're in the more precarious sectors of the labor market and are trying to raise those standards. So, I know that this might feel overwhelming in terms of the kinds of changes that I've talked about us needing, but I think what's really important to understand is that we have made a difference already in Ontario in terms of fighting to get some improvements. In 2014, we won the indexation of the minimum wage in Ontario, so the $11 that we got in 2014 has not lost its value, which is really important. In 2014, we also won some key improvements to take on wage theft, to regulate temp agencies and improve protections for migrant workers. Recently, we saw Alberta passing a $15 an hour minimum wage, and they don't even have the huge quantities of workers earning minimum wage as we do in Ontario. We've seen a huge shift to the south of us, where we've seen city after city, and now states like California passing a $15 an hour minimum wage, New York State for fast food workers. And what we're seeing is real movement around paid sick days. So now in the U.S., 5 states, 28 cities, and Washington, D.C. now have paid sick time laws on the books. And in San Francisco, we've seen some really progressive scheduling policies passed for retail workers, such as, if more hours become available, that the employer has to ask the workers who are in part-time work whether or not they would like those hours before they post a job, so that you don't have a huge percentage of part-time workers. And so, what is it that we can do here? What is it that those of you who are on this call could do? Well, there's a bunch of different things. First, you can join the Fight for 15 and Fairness campaign. This is our campaign in response to the changing workplace review. So we're fighting for 7 paid sick days. We're fighting for rules that protect everyone, for decent hours, for the right to unionize, to ensure that we're free of harassment at work. There are monthly provincial calls where you can find out what is going on in the province. And so there are many people, in communities, or at least in 45 cities, who are already part of the 15 and Fairness campaign. If you go on the 15 and Fairness website, we have a report that we have just released called Building Decent Jobs from the Ground Up. And so this is our response to the changing workplace review. So let me tell you a little bit where things are at with the process. So the 2 special advisors that were appointed by the government did public consultations during 2015. They released their interim report laying out potential solutions and options for the government to consider for legislative reform. That report came out at the end of July, so just about 7 or 8 weeks ago. Or not even that. And the submissions, the deadline for the submissions in response to that report are due October 14th. Now, not all of us can read a 320-page report. And so that's why we have done a response to that report. We have a sample letter that you can look at and endorse recommendations. And so you can check those out on the Fight for 15 and Fairness website. That's all on the front page there. The other thing is that we're very excited that we're joining with the Maitrey Foundation and Tamarack and doing a day of training in November, on November 9th in particular, where we will be, exploring these issues in greater detail. We have been building a huge alliance across the province with unions, with faith communities, with healthcare workers, airport workers, young workers, who are all joining together on a common agenda of fighting for decent work. And so you can hear more about that on November 9th. That's a day that's going to be in Mississauga, I believe, or Etobicoke. And more details will follow. And if you're interested in meeting with your MPP on this issue and you're wanting to talk to them about the kinds of issues you're seeing in your local community about and what's affecting workers in your community around precarious employment, then you can always contact, again, the Workers' Action Center or the Fight for 15 and Fairness about the specific issues you want to raise, and we have an MPP lobby kit. So those are just a few of the things that you can do, and I really encourage you to get involved. As I said, this is really going to be shaping our labor laws for the next 25 years, and so a lot of the issues that you're seeing out there, we do have the opportunity to change some of this, and many workers are getting involved in that struggle, and many organizations. So I will pass this back to Laura now.
Thank you, Deena. That was so incredible. Thank you for updating us, not only on what's happening out there, but some of the things and what needs to change and how we move forward. So thank you for all your work around this. Awesome. So we do have a few questions, and one goes back to earlier. I'm not sure which slide it was in particular, but Vicky is asking, any idea why temporary work dropped dramatically between 2007 and 2008?
Why it dropped dramatically? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that was particularly in her community. I don't think was a trend across Ontario. So I'm not really sure.
Okay, and she has left. So just in case anyone else had that question, I thought I'd continue with it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another question, and this is from Laura. And Laura asks, I imagine the employer would counter. We can't afford to absorb $45 million of cost of making change and stay in business. What is the compelling economic argument for employers to do the right thing and meet the changes proposed to support fair work for employers?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the main thing is, well, first of all, employers are breaking the law by not necessarily paying workers what they're owed, and then of course the lack of regulation and enforcement has also been a huge shift in workers not getting that. I mean, I think that I think a couple of compelling reasons I think is that we've seen a huge increase in poverty in our communities. Now, again, I'm not sure how many reports we need for this, but another report just came out this week where, it says 1 in 4 children are living in poverty, which means, of course, they're connected to their families, which are also dealing with poverty. And so they're not able to pay their bills, and it's going to be more difficult for them. And so I think the thing is that if workers are not earning decent money and not getting access to decent wages, and then not getting access to decent benefits, it's very difficult to survive. And I think it is very difficult to have money in your pockets to then support your local economy. And so more money in people's pockets means they are going to, it's going to go into consumer spending, and it's going to boost the local economy and stimulate the local economy. I also just sort of think as a basic premise, I mean, just as we've been having conversations with employers around living wages, I think what we're basically trying to say is that a decent job, which is an ILO convention that Canada has signed on to, that people should have access to decent work. They should be able to have predictable schedules. They should have decent wages. They should be able to rely on, not going to work and not having the violations of their basic employment standards. I think that's pretty compelling, and I think there are a lot of employers out there who want to do the right thing, but they're surrounded by employers who are not.
Thank you for that. And I do have another question from Ella. And Ella asks, other than the pieces mentioned about temporary foreign workers, is there any other attention to issues faced by immigrant workers, including temporary residents and permanent residents?
So I think all of the issues that I've raised in terms of changes that we're seeking would, in particular, support the conditions that face immigrant workers and workers who are vulnerable because of their status here in Canada. So I think stronger enforcement of basic standards, ensuring that workers have the ability to speak up when things are happening, all of those kinds of legislative changes that we're pushing forward on are really trying to address the issues that workers who are the most vulnerable in our workplaces experience. So absolutely, the employment standards really is the only basic floor of protection for many immigrants and for many workers who have maybe insecure status here in Canada.
Thanks for that, and thanks for clarifying. If any of us, including attendees, would like to do some public education around the review, what resources are available that can help me understand some of the key arguments and address some of the myths and challenges that I might face?
Well, on the Fight for 15 and Fairness, you can do 15andfairness.org. On our website there, you'll see under one of the tabs a bunch of resources. There are a whole series of videos that you can use. There's a whole series of fact sheets that you can use. There are many tools there that people can use to begin a conversation. So I know I've been to many community forums for instance, in St. Catherine, in Cambridge, in Peterborough, Sudbury, where local groups are just basically trying to have the conversation in their community. What is going on for you at work, and what sort of changes do you need? And even starting that conversation is a really important conversation, because I think that we need to allow workers to have spaces to talk about what's happening to them at work and not feel ashamed or not feel like they can't say this is what's going on. And so through that process so far, and using these kinds of tools of videos and fact sheets and materials that we can help support that conversation, I think it's been very powerful for people to actually start to make visible the kinds of issues that they're facing in their local labor markets.
Fantastic. Given the gaps in legislation that can result in workers not getting paid the amount owed to them, which you covered really well, if I were to give an elevator speech, or better yet, if you were to give an elevator speech for what changes we were pushing for, what would that be? What would it sound like?
Well, I think to get more money into people's pockets is to make sure that they get what they're rightfully owed. And so I think that speaks to enforcement. Because as anyone knows, if they're getting their paycheck at the end of the week and they see that they're not getting paid overtime pay, many people feel that if they talk to their employer about that they're potentially jeopardizing their jobs. That should not be the case for workers. Like, we should not have that situation happening. People should feel that their job is not threatened if they're just asking about basic conditions of work and basic entitlements. And so strong enforcement, active enforcement, enforcement that has teeth, enforcement that ensures, compliance is, I think, quite critical. I think if employers know that it's difficult to break the law and that there are real consequences to breaking the law, then we will start to see the tides turning.
Fabulous. Thank you. There is one final question, and I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'm going to throw it out to you anyhow. It's a pretty big question, and that is, what is the impact long term of precarious work? What happens if we don't change this and we don't start fighting for these rights?
I think that the long-term impact is going to be on a number of different levels. I think first, short-term and long-term, we're seeing a huge impact on people's health and mental health and physical health. And again, study after study has shown that we saw the studies come out of McMaster University and the United Way. We've seen studies coming out of many different policy institutes that show the huge impact on stress, on chronic heart illnesses, diabetes, depression, blood pressure, all of the kinds of symptoms that I think can make, on a short-term basis, life not fun, but on a long-term basis, have major consequences for people's health. And so we are already starting to see the impact of that, and that's why we're seeing a lot of doctors and nurses and healthcare workers joining in this struggle to say that, you know what, precarious work, low income is bad for your health, and that's we need to deal with that. The other thing that we're seeing is the long-term financial impact. If you have workers right now who are in low wage and precarious jobs, that people are basically just surviving. There's no money being put aside for their pensions. There's no money being put aside for any safety net or emergencies. And so what you see is that when a crisis happens, people are immediately falling into debt right away, falling into social assistance because there's no other option, and people are not being able to save any money for their retirement. And so this means, I think, the consequences of that is, I think we're going to start to see seniors who are struggling with poverty, not being able to have a decent pension, not being able to contribute to a pension right now, and again, I think a bigger burden on our tax-based system. And so I think that we need to be really cautious then of the long-term financial, social, and economic costs of precarious work. We may not see the full extent right now, but we are starting to see that in the research that's being done. But I think it's just going to get worse the more that this continues. And we're even seeing young workers themselves, graduating from college, university, massive amounts of debt, and then looking around at the job market and finding themselves working for minimum wage or low wage contract work. And so they're not able to get out of debt, not able to get on with their lives, still staying at home with their families, and not being able to be independent. So there's so many consequences.
Well, thank you for that, Deena. Really well said, and thank you for being part of today's broadcast, for sharing your labor rights wisdom with us, and thank you to all that attended today as well, and for your questions, of course. For more information about poverty reduction, you're invited to subscribe to Vibrant Communities' monthly newsletter, Cities Connect, and to join Vibrant Communities' online learning community for poverty reduction practitioners at www.vibrantcanada.ca. Join Tamarack Institute, the Workers' Action Centre, and Maytree on November 9th in Mississauga, Ontario, for a full-day workshop on the Workers' Action Centre to learn more about how to get involved in the movement to improve labor standards and enhance workers' rights in your community. Thank you all.
Thank you, Laura.